Hello and welcome everyone to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard, and today we have a great show lined up for you guys today, starting off with talking about the Panthers-Rangers Eastern Conference Finals. Game 2 in the NHL should be an exciting one. Then I'm also going to be taking a preview of another two conferences in terms of fantasy college football, so stick around for those. And last but not least, we'll be also looking at Wolves-Mavs Game 2 in the NBA, and also looking at ESPN's wide receiver rankings. Already did the QBs, already did the running backs. Why not now do the wide receivers for today's show? But as always, before we begin, I do want to ask that you do like and follow the show. Also, if you have any tips or donations, please leave them right here at the link, gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both the network, to me, my fellow podcasters, so do please think about leaving a tip or donation. Anything is greatly appreciated. Also, open to any questions. I will answer them at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's get right into the show. Should be a very exciting one today, starting off with a game 2 between two of the NHL's best teams in the Eastern Conference Finals, the Florida Panthers and the New York Rangers. Should be a very exciting game after what turned out to be kind of a disappointing Game 1, where the Florida Panthers kind of went into MSG and did whatever they wanted with the New York Rangers. Now, in terms of betting odds for tonight's game, the Florida money line is at minus 115, the Rangers money line is at minus 110, and the Rangers are favored by 1.5 goals. They're giving 1.5 goals to the Florida Panthers. In terms of fantasy, the big two players that I want to highlight right now, I will get into some other players, but these two players are the ones that are the big ticket options for you today in terms of daily fantasy hockey. Matthew Tkachuk, valued at $14K in DraftKings. He is expected to have 17 FanDuel's fantasy points. And then Chris Kreider is valued at 11.5K. FanDuel, sorry, I made a mistake of saying DraftKings before, my mistake. He is valued at 11.5K, like I said, and he's expected to have 16.6 FanDuel's fantasy points. Now, I don't expect that this game or this series will come down to these two players. Obviously, I don't even think of Chris Kreider as the most integral option for the New York Rangers, because of the fact that the New York Rangers got here by being a very well-rounded team, both defensively and in terms of offense. They got contributions from all down the line, similar to that of the Florida Panthers. That is why I did not expect Game 1 to go the way it did, and I do not expect Game 2 to go the same way as Game 1 did. That being said, those two guys are two of the bigger options that I expect to perform in terms of both of these teams' best players. I think that Matthew Tkachuk, he's the heartbeat of this team ever since coming in from Calgary. He has been an explosive force for the Florida Panthers, elevated them to that status of being one of the best teams, not in just the Eastern Conference, but in all the NHL. And then Chris Kreider, what a Rangers legend he is, and I fully expect his numbers to hang from MSG's rafters when it's all said and done for him. But in terms of the series, he just needs to not only elevate himself and his own play, but those around him. I'm looking at players like Vincent Trocheck, Micah Zibanejad, and a still young line, Alexi Lafreniere, and guys like Capo Caco, Philip Hedl, obviously a huge piece that I thought was going to be much better than he is now because of what he did last playoffs, coming back from injury. But ultimately, I think that those two guys moving forward are the offensive fulcrums for both of these respective teams. Now, in terms of defense, I think that both of these goalies are also integral. Obviously, the guy Sergei Bobrovsky, coming off that huge shutout in Game 1, obviously came in on a heater. I think he was 4-1 in his last 5 games, had a crazy goals against average of like 1.62 or something. And also, he's just been absolutely fantastic as that last line of defense for the Florida Panthers, whereas a guy like Igor Shesterkin has kind of been disappointing, in my opinion, to open this series. I think Rangers fans obviously did not expect him to come out as flat as he did, give up an easy 3 goals. But at the end of the day, I think that Igor Shesterkin, is one of those players who can get hot at any time. He is going to help younger lines like the kid line get together, reintegrate their ideas, because obviously the Rangers, they're all about shifting from their more experienced players to younger lines and trying to integrate both youth and experience, both physicality and finesse into their squad. And I think that's why teams up to this point have had such a hard time of combating them. But if there is a team that I think could have, it is the Florida Panthers, and that's exactly what they did in Game 1. So look for in Game 2 the Rangers to want to integrate every single part of their lineup as quickly as possible to kind of confuse the Panthers and get back to what they know best. On the Panthers side of things, I think the keys for the Panthers is just to be themselves again. I think that the Panthers came out loose. They went into one of the best stadiums in all of sports and got a result they really wanted. I think that it was because of their own style and structure that they were able to get off to that hot start. I fully expect the Rangers to kind of combat that, but I still think that the Panthers will get their chances. Obviously, Igor Shesterkin is not feeling as confident as he has in the past. So I think that overall, this is going to be a close game again. I think that the Rangers have learned their lessons. I think that the young players are going to start getting more opportunities to play and get more experience. I think that I'm looking for Peter Laviolette to include a guy like Matt Rempe to add that physicality that the Rangers so desperately need to overcome the high danger scoring opportunities that the Florida Panthers will certainly get against Igor. So overall, I think this is going to be a much closer game. Getting back to those betting odds, I think I'm going to take the Florida Panthers money line on this one. I'm just more confident that Florida is very well structured. I think that they have more ideas. I think they just have more experience in terms of who they want out on the ice in any given situations. They can combat the Rangers' weaknesses when they put out their younger players onto the ice. So overall, I feel more confident in taking the Florida Panthers money line outright than in anything else in this game because of how well structured and the shocking nature they took Game 1. That being said, the over-under for tonight's game is at 5.5 points. I think I'm going to take the over on this one. I think that Florida's going to come out swinging yet again. There are high variations of whether they bring out a guy like Kachuk, a guy like Sam Bennett, whoever it is along those lines. They will come out confident. I still think that their worst lines are still much better than the Rangers' worst lines, so I think that ultimately Florida's going to score a lot of goals, in my opinion. I think this is going to be another testing day for Igor Shesterkin. But that being said, I think the Rangers will score some goals as well. I don't think that Sergei Bobrovsky is going to be on this heater for much longer. I think something will have to give for Sergei Bobrovsky in this game. So that is why I am taking the over in terms of goals. I think that in terms of fantasy, those two guys that I just mentioned, Kachuk and Kreider, are your safest bets to roster as either your captains or utility guy. Ultimately, I just think that they are the heartbeats of these respective teams, and I think that in order for their team to go, they have to go. So why not yourselves take a flyer on them for your daily fantasy hockey team, because they are such fantastic players, so well balanced, can create out of anything. And so I am confident in saying that they will be the people or the guys going forward in terms of daily fantasy hockey who I most rely on. In terms of goalies, they were nowhere to be found on today's FanDuel's projections. I was kind of shocked at that, but I'm not necessarily too shocked at that. I think that both of these goalies on any given night will face a number of chances because both of these teams are so well balanced, like I continue to say. But ultimately, if I were to rely on one over the other, it would be Sergei Bobrovsky. I think he's the hottest goalie in the playoffs right now. He's going to continue to elevate this team. I think the Panthers are the most confident team in the playoffs right now, and that will trickle down to each and every single one of them. That being said, I just can't see Igor Shesterkin breaking out of this slump. I think that as try as they might, the MSG faithful will not, elevate him because of how effective the Florida Panthers are in terms of sucking the life out of teams. That should just about do it for this segment. It was very exciting to look at this, what should be an interesting game too. But coming up next after the break, we are going to be talking about the Big Ten in terms of fantasy college football. This conference has just been crazy in terms of who has been added. We're getting a UCLA-Rutgers game coming up next year. So that's something that I couldn't have even pondered. So it should be a very exciting segment. Stick around. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Coming up, we have a very exciting segment where I'll be dissecting the Big Ten in terms of my fantasy college football outlook. But before we do that, I'd keep on wanting to remind you about the tips and donations. Do please leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to everyone at the network, including me and my fellow podcasters doing their thing. So do leave whatever you can. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for doing so. Now, coming up next, like I said, we have a very exciting segment. We're going to be looking at the Big Ten fantasy football preview. Now, the Big Ten in the past couple of weeks has been one of the most volatile conferences with all these new teams coming in, these Western Conference kind of blood, But ultimately, when I think about the Big Ten, can you really overlook the only two teams that have mattered in this league for the past decade or so? That's right, I'm talking about the big boys up north in Ohio State and Michigan. Both of these teams coming up this year are very interesting in terms of their differing outlooks. Obviously, when we look at a team like Ohio State, we look at a team that is steeped in talent. We have a wide receiver room who, in my opinion, could be one of the best in all of college football next year. Whereas when we look at a team like Michigan, there are big questions not only in terms of who's going to be out there on the field, but how this coaching change from Jim Harbaugh, who had cemented Michigan as one of the premier Big Ten programs, beating Ohio State for the past 3 years, now transitioning to Sharon Moore, who kind of wants to continue it, but with what army does he choose to do so? That is the interesting question. But first, we will start off for Ohio State. Their probably going to be one of the top 3 teams in the country, in my opinion. And it all starts with the receiver rooms. We will get to Kyle McCord as a fantasy prospect in a minute, but I do want to talk very in depth about this exciting receiver room. Obviously, they do lose Marvin Harrison Jr., a guy who obviously is one of the most generational talents we have seen coming out of college to the Arizona Cardinals. I think he's going to go on to have a bright future in the NFC West. But that does not mean that there is no promise in this wide receiver room. On the contrary, there is a lot of promise here. And it all starts with returner Emeka Egbuka. While Marvin Harrison Jr. got all the plaudits last year, that was mainly due to the fact that Emeka Egbuka has had his injury concerns, but this year he's going to come back healthy, and he is going to be highly coveted on the fantasy boards come fantasy college football draft time. So Emeka Egbuka, obviously his production was limited, so his abilities is not translating to his stats because of those injuries. But ultimately, I think since he's the number 1 receiver returning to what I think is one of the younger receiving corps in college football, he is going to be highly coveted, both in real life. Look for Kyle McCord to always call his number close in games. He's going to have a very inflated stat line because of that, but also as one of the premier fantasy prospects in my mind. Now, transitioning to other members of this Ohio State receiver room, kind of a younger bent than we've seen in the past, starting off with returning sophomore Jeremiah Smith turning heads at the spring game. Obviously an early enrollee, very exciting prospect. We haven't seen him play in a real game time, but ultimately I think that from the glowing reviews we've heard from him from the Ohio State spring game, and what coaches have said about him, he's widely admired as one of the more coveted younger wide receivers in college football right now. Just his speed, his ability to catch the ball in any position, his catch radius. I think that ultimately Jeremiah Smith is going to be one of those players to watch as someone who's going to have a breakout season. I think that he is going to elevate Kyle McCord, who we will get to, I promise, in the future. But overall, I think that Jeremiah Smith is kind of the wild card of this Ohio State receiver room, and in terms of daily fantasy. Last but not least, Carnell Tate is an exciting freshman, just came in. I think that ultimately he's not going to be relied upon right away as he is a freshman, but they are entrusting him in these spring practices with a lot of different things that he has to do, wide receiver drills. They're testing him early and often, and I think that comes college football season, Carnell Tate is going to be one of those guys who you can maybe want to consider putting as a bench option, a flex option. So Carnell Tate, a name to remember for the Ohio State receiver room. And like I said, that leaves the quarterback who will be throwing these guys the ball, Kyle McCord. Kyle McCord, he's an interesting quarterback in my opinion. I think that Kyle McCord is not someone who is, that talented in terms of having one trait that stands out above the rest, but I do think he's a steady hand. I think that obviously he's not going to put up huge fantasy numbers, but he will put up huge fantasy numbers in terms of who he throws to. I think he will affect and inflate wide receiver scores rather than his own scores. So while Kyle McCord is a quarterback who I would shy away from in terms of fantasy, I still think he will inflate the numbers of his wide receivers because of their own abilities. But that should just about do it for Ohio State. Moving on to the other big team in Michigan, the one with more question marks than answers right now because of the transition from Jim Harbaugh to Sharon Moore, but who they have in their quarterback room. They have one of the deepest quarterbacks rooms in the country, but also one of the most confusing, as there is no one just yet who I can confidently say they think is the starter. Out of those four, Jaden Davis, Alex Orji, Jack Tuttle, and Jaden Denegal, they have been saying that Alex Orji is the most likely to start. he is the one who we have seen the most of from Michigan. Obviously, they used him in more of like a scat QB kind of role, a very interesting role last year, kind of late in the season. But that does not mean there's not talent in this quarterback room. But as Michigan quarterback, as we saw with J.J. McCarthy, they really aren't going to be expected to do much. They have a very deep running back room in just one guy, Donovan Edwards. He can just make magic out of nothing. He's one of the best in the country at the running back position. But I think that the Michigan quarterback is a very interesting position, mainly because of the lack of depth that you see in a 4 QB room in college football, where you can point to teams in the SEC who have that depth. There's not that much depth in the Michigan room, and it's not something I would expect to see, because obviously you have a guy like J.J. McCarthy who is a steady presence, albeit not necessarily explosive, but overall he was a very steady hand. And in terms of replacing him, I kind of feel like Sharon Moore would want to continue more with Harbaugh's style, which is to be more physical. So overall, while I'm looking at the Michigan quarterback as a very important position, I do think that it's not going to be a person who is coveted come fantasy draft him. I think the fantasy prospect on the Michigan Wolverines everyone should have their eye on is obviously Donovan Edwards. He's going to go very high in drafts. But I just wanted to highlight the Michigan quarterback room in contrast to their Big Ten arch rivals, Ohio State's receiver room, because they are in very different places right now, and who knows what the game will look like when Michigan will travel to Ohio State, I believe. But that should just about do it for this segment in Big Ten fantasy football. Coming up next, we'll be looking at the Big 12 and their interesting conference. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free.
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Now, coming up for this next segment, I talked about the Big Ten last segment, but right now, all focus is turned to the Big 12, a hugely volatile conference now that Texas and Oklahoma have gone and left to the SEC. This is probably one of the more wide open conferences in the country. I could not tell you right now my predictions for who will come out of it as the champion because of how volatile it is, but I just want to highlight two teams who I think, in my mind, are clearer favorites right now than some of the others. Obviously, you bring in some West Coast blood like the Big Ten did, but this Western Conference blood is so equal with these Big 12 teams, that I think they could just outright win it. But first, I want to start with a team that has already been in the Big 12 for quite some time, and that is Kansas State. I think, in my mind's eye, Kansas State, even when Texas and Oklahoma were in there, were probably one of the top 5 teams in that conference, and I expect a lot out of them this season, mainly due to one of the more intriguing QB options out there on the market in terms of fantasy, come fantasy draft time, Avery Johnson. Avery Johnson is a young quarterback. He was an early enrollee last year in January semester. He came into the program as a highly coveted prospect, 4-star prospect. And the reason why I want to highlight Avery Johnson is he's a very unique quarterback. He is a very rapid quarterback. He can throw the ball accurately, short to intermediate routes, probably going to be very, very exceptional in those departments. We saw a sneak peek of him both in the season opener, where he went 3 for 4 for 55 pass yards in Kansas State's season opener against Southeastern Mississippi State last year. And we also saw him in more limited game time throughout the season, but his breakout performance was in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, where he was the MVP. Didn't attempt many passes, but his legs told the entire story, and they spoke volumes about who this kid can be as an athlete. Highly coveted coming out of high school. I think that Avery Johnson as a fantasy option is very exciting, mainly due to the high risk, high reward kind of aspect that he has. I think that since he hasn't played a full season yet, I wouldn't want to rely on him, but I do think that if you're a kind of high risk, high reward kind of person at a very important position, I do think he is one to look out for. I think that Kansas State is always going to be a team that can support whoever they put in at quarterback. Obviously, they saw with Will Howard, who has gone on to Ohio State. I think that they have such a good setup. They have one of the best setups out of, more or less a lesser known team inside their conference. I think that saying something to challenge Texas and Oklahoma is one thing, but now that they're gone, I think that they will take full advantage, mainly because of the personnel that Avery Johnson has. They returned their solid running backs, Phillip Brooks, DJ Giddens. I think that Avery Johnson just has one of the best support systems in all of the Big 12. But moving on from a less experienced quarterback to a more experienced quarterback, let's talk about Utah. Utah comes into the Big 12 after being in the Pac-12, winning the Pac-12 a couple of years ago with a quarterback who seems to have been in college football forever, but when he is playing is probably one of the better and more hardened college quarterbacks in all of college football. Cameron Rising. I think that Cameron Rising is going to lead Utah into the Big 12 with heads held high after leaving the Pac-12 with a couple of Pac-12 titles. Cam Rising, though, seems like he is immortal in college football. It seems like he's everywhere. He can never leave college football. Obviously, he came in during the COVID era, and he seems to have endless years of eligibility, but that's just an even better thing for Kyle Whittingham in Utah. I think that, last year he did not play as much, and that forced Bryson Barnes to play most of the season, but when Cam Rising is healthy, he is one of the most underrated quarterbacks in the game. Let's just go over his 2022 stats when he last played. He had 3,034 yards, 26 touchdowns, only 8 picks, rushed for 465 yards and 60 Ds as well. Not known for rushing much, but that just goes to show how willing he is to lead this Utah team that is ever changing. Obviously, they seem to produce talent on a level that can compete with some of the better teams in the country, as we saw in the Pac-12. Now in the Big 12, they're not competing with as high-end teams, so I expect Cam Rising, even though his skill level players aren't as experienced as they were, obviously they lost Dalton Kincaid, they still have a guy in Brent Quaith who's going to be one of the best tight ends in college football. So I fully expect Cameron Rising to come out there and prove why he is willing to be one of the best college quarterbacks, be one of the most hardworking college quarterbacks in the game. But those are the two main Big 12 teams that I wanted to get out of the way. Another one that I kind of want to look at, mainly due to their level of turnover, is the Baylor Bears, because we don't necessarily know who the Baylor Bears starting quarterback is. I think that after the loss of Blake Shapen, they are searching for options. They've rotated in and out who their starting quarterback is. So this is a huge question mark of a season for the Baylor Bears and for Dave Aranda as well. Obviously, when he first came in, he won the Big 12 title, and everyone expected Baylor to be one of the premier teams in the Big 12. That was when they had Charlie Brewer and they had more stability at the QB position. But right now, I can't tell you who I think the Baylor quarterback is going to be next year. I literally think that while they have some nice options for this coming season in Sawyer Robertson, who did get some time last year and performed semi-well. They also have Daquan Finn, who transferred in from Toledo, has more experience in one of those mid-major programs, second-team All-MAC selection. I just think that this is a very pivotal year for the Baylor Bears football program, mainly because of the fact that after that high of winning the Big 12 championship a couple years ago, they really came back down to earth. They really thought that Blake Shapen was the answer after Charlie Brewer left. I just think that as a team, Baylor needs to come together and figure out who they want to be as a team. Obviously, they will always have one of the better defenses in the Big 12. Dave Aranda is a highly defensive-minded coach, but on the offensive side of the ball, there are still questions to be answered. Another team of note, the Oklahoma State Cowboys. I think that they're also another team that can also challenge that hierarchy. Obviously, Alan Bowman, another quarterback like Cam Rising, who seems to not go anywhere. They were in the Big 12 championship last year, but obviously they could not compete with a team of Texas caliber. But in much more limited Big 12, I expect them to come out swing. I think that Alan Bowman, he's a very experienced quarterback, solid of that Cam Rising mold, do whatever it takes to win. I think it's going to be a very interesting fantasy option. But the guy who I'm looking to carry Oklahoma State to the promised land, if they do perform well, is Ollie Gordon II. I think that Ollie Gordon II is the best running back in the country. Early Heisman Trophy contender, in my opinion. I want to see a non-QB player win it, and if anyone can do it, it is him. So, that being said, I just think that the two teams who I mentioned earlier on in this segment, Kansas State with Avery Johnson and Utah with Cam Rising, are my early favorites in this conference. But I completely forgot about another team who I think is going to be a favorite coming in from the Pac-12, and that is the Arizona Wildcats. I completely forgot about them, and I do want to mention them now. What a crazy turnaround they've had under Jedd Fisch. Kudos to him for elevating this program now, leading it into the Big 12 with a young quarterback in Noah Fafita, who is also a Heisman Trophy candidate as well, who I fully expect to put up huge numbers with his number one wide receiver, Tyrone McMillan. I think that those two are going to be one of the better QB wide receiver duos in the country, kind of in the Penix Rome Odunze mold, kind of that air raid system coming into the Big 12, and proving that Arizona can be a premier college football program moving into the future. I think that ultimately the Big 12 is a very exciting fantasy college football conference because of the versatility in the players, the depth in terms of who is on the quarterback market, who is interesting, who has the experience, who doesn't have the experience and could break out, like Avery Johnson, in my opinion. So ultimately, this was such a fun segment because Big 12, as a Texas fan, is one of my favorite conferences. And now that Texas is gone, I think it's going to be much more wide open. But that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we will move on to the NBA. We'll be talking about the Western Conference Finals Game 2 matchup between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We're almost there to the end of the show, but this segment is a very interesting segment because we have a Western Conference Finals game tonight between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks. After a highly interesting Game 1 where we saw Kyrie Irving step up, Luka Doncic step up later in the game, and Ant Edwards be almost silent. I think that Game 2 is going to be a very interesting one in terms of betting trends, but also in terms of fantasy projections. So we'll start with fantasy projections on DraftKings this time. I did FanDuel for the hockey, but this is DraftKings for basketball. So starting off with the two stars, Luka Doncic, 13.4K valuation on the market. He's expected to have 58.5 DraftKings fantasy points. And then Anthony Edwards for the Minnesota Timberwolves, 11.4K valuation, 49.5 DraftKings fantasy points. But also, keep in mind that Kyrie Irving's a little bit on the cheaper side tonight, also at 11.4K valuation, 41 projected DraftKings fantasy points. I think that is quite the steal from the way he played in Game 1. Looking at the betting odds for tonight's game, we have Minnesota at -5.5. They're favored by 5.5 at home. The over-under is 207.5. And the money lines are Dallas plus 185 and Minnesota minus 220. So coming off that Game 1, I'm really interested in the way Kyrie Irving played because of how he was able to attack Minnesota's drop coverage, one of the most suffocating defenses in the league, and make them pay attention to his versatility as a point guard. So I just wanted to shout out Kyrie Irving because of his ability to exploit that drop coverage when Minnesota decides to drop deeper into the paint to mitigate for when Luka Doncic wants to drive and all his mid-range prowess. So I just wanted to underline the fact that I feel like Kyrie Irving right now is being overlooked in Game 2 because of what he did in Game 1. I think that he is the best fantasy prospect right now in terms of what he can do based off of what Minnesota presented in terms of defense. And on Minnesota's side of the ball, I feel that they're kind of hard done by. I don't think this is Game 1 was one of those games where, one team really outplayed the other. I just think it came down to like more detail-oriented plays from the Dallas Mavericks based off of their offensive game plan and who they are as a team, rather than any misgivings I have about the Minnesota defense. I think that the Minnesota defense still played a fantastic game, but it's just the ability of players like Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving who can set the tone for a team like Dallas. But looking at a player like Ant, who has been kind of absent in terms of where he was in the previous series, I feel like Anthony Edwards is one of those players who, when he's expected to perform, I just feel like he has this innate pressure put on him as the young superstar, the young face of the Minnesota Timberwolves to deliver. And I think that more experienced players in Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving and a more experienced team in the Dallas Mavericks is willing to exploit that. They don't care that Anthony Edwards wants to cement himself as a star of this league. They just want to win the series. And I don't think that Minnesota wants to fall into that trap where they get sucked into Dallas's style of play, because that's not how they want to play. They want to play defense first and have Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, and Karl Anthony Towns provide on the offensive side of the ball in whatever ways they can. Another big aspect of Game 1 that I think is going to be quite questions in Game 2 is the play of Dallas's role players. I think that Dallas's role players are very pivotal to how they play. I think that guys like Derek Lively and Dan Gafford need more minutes in order to continue to combat the paint presence on the defensive end of both Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns. So, that being said, look for Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford as cheaper fantasy options, maybe that you can rotate into your team tonight because of who I think they can be in this series. That being said, let's look ahead at some of the player prop bets that I think are going to be very important. I think that Luka Doncic, it all starts with him tonight. I think that tonight he will have over 30.5 points. Kind of took a little bit of a backseat to Kyrie, but that was mainly, in my mind, how the Dallas Mavericks wanted to set up their offensive game plan because of what they saw in the Minnesota defense. I think that Luka will always get his own in games like this. I think that he's not to be overlooked. And ultimately, I think that he will have a higher level of production tonight rather than in Game 1 where he kind of brought it on later on in the game and had Kyrie take over the first half. In terms of Anthony Edwards, I just don't see him going over 25 points tonight. I think that what Minnesota needs to focus on to win this series is creating opportunities through their defense. I think that they're one of the best defenses in the league, mainly because not only do they shut you down, but they can force turnovers. And that's how I think they're going to get easy points against the Dallas Mavericks. When the Dallas Mavericks set their defense, I do think they're better prepared for what Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, and Karl Anthony Towns can deliver. We saw it last game. So ultimately, I feel like the Minnesota Timberwolves offense is going to be quicker, which does not necessarily, in my mind, suit Anthony Edwards. I think that it's going to be more of a paint-based game. I think that the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to focus on getting into the paint and making things tough for the Dallas role players in the paint tonight. So I just feel that Anthony Edwards is going to be impacted by that. So I'm going to go with the under. In terms of role players, I'm going to say Derek Lively goes over 6.5 rebounds tonight. I think that Derek Lively's a very interesting player. Lives up to his name every night. He's a very lively player. But ultimately, I just think that he is willing to do whatever it takes for Dallas to get to the finals this year. I think that he's a very nice addition to what they already had. Fits so well into the team. Helps add to the fact that Dallas wants to also pay attention to defense as well. They're not just an offensive-oriented team centered around Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. They can focus on the defensive end as well. And I think that Derek Lively will be a big part of that tonight. So look out for him to be on the offensive and defensive boards all night long, harassing Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns down low. Speaking of both Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns, I think that Rudy Gobert is going to have 3.5 blocks tonight. I think that he needs to be more active on the boards for the Timberwolves to tie the series up. I also think that Karl Anthony Towns is going to have, in my opinion, over 3.5 three-pointers. I think that Karl Anthony Towns' offense last game was something that stood out to me. I think that he is going to try and stretch the floor for Minnesota, get guys like Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford further out of the paint so that Rudy Gobert can attack, run the pick and roll between him and Gobert. So I think that Karl Anthony Towns will be heavily effective in this game tonight. Also, I'm looking at a guy in Naz Reid who did not have as big a game as I thought he was going to. He's a very key player, mainly in clutch situations, but overall I think he's going to have a bigger night tonight. So I do think that I would lay off him tonight in terms of daily fantasy because of how volatile he is in terms of whether or not he's going to get bigger minutes down the stretch. So Naz Reid, I say bench him tonight. Another player who I think is going to be a no from me in terms of daily fantasy is Jaden McDaniels. I do not think he's going to keep producing the way he is for the rest of the series. I just think that Dallas, from what I saw in Game 1, is willing to squeeze all the players deeper into the perimeter, try and stop them before they drive into the paint. And I think that Jaden McDaniels is not going to benefit from that as someone who wants to stretch the floor for Minnesota. So I'm very wary of him as a daily fantasy pick. But that should just about do it for this segment in terms of Wolves-Mavs. Again, looking forward to this game. Think that this is going to be a very even matchup in terms of who I expect to come out on top. I think that, like I said, Game 1 was more of a testing ground. Nothing much was learned about the team except for the fact that Kyrie Irving was willing to attack. I think tonight Kyrie Irving is my fantasy player pick, is someone to look out for. But overall, I just think that Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns want to come out for their hometown crowd and get back home court advantage, make this an even series. So, that being said, I am picking the Timberwolves to win tonight's game. I think that ultimately they will also win the next 2 games, taking one from Dallas on the road. I'm looking further ahead, but that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up as our last segment of the day, we are going to be looking at something very exciting. I did the QBs for the NFL ESPN rankings. I did the running backs. Today we look at the wide receivers. So stick around for that segment. We will be right back. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. This is sadly the last segment of today's show, but I promise it is a good one. We are going to be looking at the ESPN wide receiver rankings for fantasy football for 2024. I'm very excited about this list. We have a lot of young, talented wide receivers who, while I don't think are in our top 10, I hope to see break into the top 10, but I do feel that this top 10 is probably the best in terms of positions that I've seen. I think that it's very fair to the top wide receivers in the league. I don't think there are going to be many surprises. But overall, let's just jump right into it. Let's start out with number 1, CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb is a wide receiver who honestly elevates the team that he's in. I think that the Dallas Cowboys are very lucky to have a player of CeeDee Lamb's caliber, especially at the wide receiver position, because it honestly just gives them a player that Dak Prescott can rely upon in any situation. We saw it last year when they came out and were one of the league's best offenses for a very long time. Obviously, I don't really have any worries with CeeDee Lamb because of his ability not only to create contested catches out of nothing, but his health. I think that his health is very important. Been one of the healthiest receivers in the league, and I think that next year will be no different. I think that he well deserves this number 1 ranking in ESPN's rankings because of his ability to elevate his team, to run a myriad number of routes, one of the best route runners in the league. I just think that he will honestly help the Dallas Cowboys to the NFC East title, in my opinion. And also, I think that he'll have much better playoffs than he did last year, just because of how versatile he is. But coming up next at number 2 is Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is one of those options where you kind of have to look at him as a player rather than the team he's in, because the team he's in is very versatile as well. I think that the Miami Dolphins are everyone's favorite team when it comes to fantasy because of how many points these players can put up in terms of fantasy. I think that not only will you see Tyreek Hill produce so many points, but you will see guys like Jalen Waddle, Devon Achane, even Tua put up a lot of fantasy points. And so I think that this ranking reflects the team that Tyreek Hill is in now. Honestly, if he was still with the Chiefs, I would say the same thing. I just feel that Tyreek Hill, while a very talented receiver, his overall status is elevated by the fact that he's in a team that also has a lot of fantasy breakout stars within it. So I think that he's deserving of the number 2 spot. I love Tyreek Hill. I love his pace, his speed, the agility he adds to the wide receiver position. Unlike any player that we've seen in the league in quite some time. But I'm just saying, be wary of the fact that he is on the Miami Dolphins, a team filled with a lot of fantasy stars. Coming up next at the number 3 position is Jamar Chase. I love Jamar Chase as a receiver. I think that, honestly, he's still, in my opinion, one of the more underrated receivers in the league, mainly because of the fact that Joe Burrow has had his number of injuries, and we really don't get to see that Joe Burrow-Jamar Chase connection that comes in from LSU. But that being said, I still think Jamar Chase is one of the most talented receivers in the league. When all is said and done, I could see him pushing CD for that number 1 spot at the end of the season. I think that Jamar Chase, in a team where the wide receiver core is in question right now with T. Higgins, what's he going to do? I think that, Jamar Chase, this is his opportunity to step up and be the guy that the Bengals need him to be. I think that he will continue to do that because of Joe Burrow coming back from injury. I think that the Bengals will benefit from that, and overall, Jamar Chase is a well-deserved number 3. And number 4 is someone who I think that a lot of people could see at number 1 as well, Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson is a very talented wide receiver, but obviously I think this ranking reflects the fact that they have a new quarterback coming in. I think that whether it's Sam Darnold or J.J. McCarthy, they're not going to be as willing to throw the ball as far downfield as Justin Jefferson wants, whereas someone like Kirk Cousins could have done that for him, and that was why he was generally viewed as the wide receiver 1 for the past couple of years. I think that overall, though, you can't underestimate Justin Jefferson just because of the new system that he's going to be under. I think that J.J. McCarthy is going to be a very adaptable quarterback. I think that he fits into Kevin O'Connell's system very well. Even Sam Darnold, as we saw last year when he was in some limited game time for San Fran, he fits in well, transitioning from the Kyle Shanahan system to the Kevin O'Connell system. So we'll definitely have to see who Kevin O'Connell names his quarterback to really see how Justin Jefferson gets affected in terms of fantasy. But overall, I still think he is a very deserving receiver, deserves to be in the top 10. At number 5, a receiver who I think has been inflated because of a deal that his quarterback signed this past offseason, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown, in my opinion, is the best route runner in the league, mainly due to the fact that the Lions have now this depth in their skill positions that allows them to have more verbiage, allows Ben Johnson, who was willing to stay with them, create more opportunities for everyone in the system. But Amon-Ra is always Jared Goff's go-to number 1 receiver, and it's the reason why I think Jared Goff got that much money, is because Amon-Ra St. Brown relies on Jared Goff. Jared Goff relies on Amon-Ra St. Brown. That being said, I think the Lions' offense will get a little more versatile. I think that Ben Johnson will continue to get more creative because they rely on him so much to create opportunities for not only guys like St. Brown, but guys like Laporte, guys like Jamison Williams, who we'll get to see in a year where he's playing throughout the whole season, hopefully. So I feel like Amon-Ra St. Brown is well deserved to be in the number 5 spot, mainly because of the new extension from Jared Goff, and mainly because I believe that Ben Johnson will want to get him as much opportunities as possible. At number 6, we have another Brown, A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown is a very incredible wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles, mainly because he wants to be with Jalen Hurts, and I feel like while last year was not a very good season for the Philadelphia Eagles, I do think that Jalen Hurts regressed. I think that's just a blip in the trend of Jalen Hurts' career. I think that Jalen Hurts will get back to the level we saw him 2 years ago when he was challenging the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. So I just think that A.J. Brown will have his own fantasy stats inflated because of that. Obviously, they still have Devontae Smith, who's a very reliable wide receiver. But at the end of the day, A.J. Brown is their number 1 guy, and he is very well deserving to be on this list. I think that Jalen Hurts is pleased to have him. I think that Jalen Hurts will want to go to him very often with the deep ball. I think that Jalen Hurts to A.J. Brown is going to be one of the best deep ball connections in the game next year. So I'm very happy to see A.J. Brown on this list. And number 7 is a kind of our first surprise, but I think that this guy deserves it because of the surprise he was last year, and that is Puka Nacua. Obviously now above Cooper Kupp in the minds of ESPN writers and pundits, but I think it's well deserved because Cooper Kupp was injured for large parts of last year, and Puka Nacua was asked to elevate his game, 5th round wide receiver out of BYU, and he did just that. I think that Puka Nacua deserves all the plaudits, had a great year, voted to the Pro Bowl deservedly. I think that Matthew Stafford is going to look to him. I think that he's one of those receivers who's just reliable in terms of getting open. He's not the fastest, he's not the strongest receiver, but he just gets the job done, and he does it well every single week. I think that he deserves to be in the top 10. Honestly, I'm not as surprised as some people might be by this, but I think that he is one of the best receivers in the NFC West and the entire NFL. Coming in at number 8, I think that this guy, obviously getting his quarterback back this year, will see his numbers rise, and that is Garrett Wilson. We still haven't seen the Garrett Wilson to Aaron Rodgers connection just yet, but I think that it will be one of the most versatile in the league. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers is going to want to get the ball out of his hands as quickly as possible, and Garrett Wilson is the receiver that will help him do just that. He's a solid route runner. He's going to help Aaron Rodgers stay upright just by his ability to get open. He is the wide receiver 1 for the New York Jets, just elevates that skill position core above average. I think that Aaron Rodgers will be glad to have him next year, and so I think that he will definitely be a top 10 wide receiver now and at the end of the year. Coming in at number 9, I think this guy is honestly overrated in my opinion because we don't really know what his team is, and that is Davante Adams with the Las Vegas Raiders. I think that there are too many question marks surrounding Vegas right now where I can't say that Davante Adams will have a reliable quarterback to throw him the ball. He's definitely one of the most talented receivers, always was reliable when he was with the Packers, but the Las Vegas Raiders are not the Packers. Antonio Pierce is not a coach who I expect to want to throw the ball often, as we saw last year. So I kind of feel like Davante Adams is the first person who I would say isn't necessarily as deserving as the others to be on this list, mainly due to the question marks surrounding his team. But to round out the top 10 is another one of those guys, and Chris Olave. I think that Chris Olave is a stellar receiver. I think that him and Garrett Wilson coming out of Ohio State were 2 guys who I think that immediately adapted to the NFL. But Garrett Wilson has the benefit of Aaron Rodgers, whereas I don't know who Chris Olave will benefit from because of the Saints quarterback situation as well, very similar to the Raiders. And that is why, to round out this top 10, I feel like these two guys, well, yes, they're big names in the wide receiver market. I just don't think that they're going to be as effective. But that should just about do it for today's show. Thank you guys for tuning into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. As always, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe for today's show. As always, leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud, a question even, which I will answer at the beginning of next episode. That should just about do it. Thank you guys again for being such a great audience. It means the world to me starting out on this GSMC's Fantasy Sports Podcast. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you next episode.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit.